I think that the West will continue to focus on sticks rather than carrots. It's more comfortable using them. We've seen the growth of sanctions in recent years, quite significantly. There's a very good book that just came out about this that I'd like to recommend to your listeners called Bucking the Buck by Daniel McDowell. Whereas it's not so comfortable using geo-economic carrots in the same way, often because it's seen as, oh, this goes against free market principles,
Right.
and the like, which I think is a bit of a silly argument, but that's the way the discussion is. On the Russian side, I do think they'll broadly follow that advice that I gave. My overall advice would have been, not to escalate it as globally. I don't think they'll follow that, but I do very much think that, they will look to do as much as they can to support Trump and the sort of narratives that he has. Trump himself has recently criticized Biden for he claims Biden is the one weakening the dollar system. I would say that Trump is entirely mistaken about that, and that it was his presidency that put it under greater threat than anything else, but we can perhaps discuss that later. And I think that the Kremlin will, excuse me, will really focus on trying to stimulate those divisions within Europe as well, because Europe needs to approve its sanctions being rolled over every 6 months or more often every year, whereas the US, it's very hard to lift sanctions. It's very easy to impose them. In some ways, it's the opposite in the European Union. So I think he'll look to really, stoke those divides there. Where exactly the next opportunity is just because of the election calendar, there isn't a sort of great one coming up. Spain maybe, could support the far right there, which might be needed for a coalition with the main center-right party. There are a lot of linkages between that far right party, Vox, and Russian actors. I don't think it's an important enough issue for Spain to really exercise the veto there. But if it can find 2 or 3 more Orban-type characters, as there is in Hungary, there it will really find ways to undermine it. We see this playing out right now in the aftermath of the 5th elections in the last 4 years in Bulgaria, and in Slovakia as well. So it's taking place already in some of the smaller European countries, where I think he needs an opening, though, in a major European state, and even in Italy, where Matteo Renzi, the former now again deputy prime minister, leader of one of the right-wing parties there, Forza Italia, he once, went to Russia with this shirt, that said, no to sanctions, and signed a friendship agreement and the like. But even, that government that he's a member of, led by another right-wing party, has supported the sanctions agenda. So I don't think it'll be as easy in Europe going forward as it was in the 2014 to 2022 period, just because of the proximity and the level of, horrors on display on the European doorstep in Ukraine.
So then you are, in essence, what you're saying is that the most probable scenario is further escalation. Independent now on the actual battle line, but also on the economic warfare front, right?
Yeah, I think that.
Right. Yeah. So
yeah,
go for it, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think the biggest escalations have been taken with that central bank sanction, the sort of, the largest moves, at least from the Western side, that we could see. We're seeing the move towards tweaking around, the Dutch have said they're going to push Russia out of LNG markets. The EU is trying to find a way to push Russia out of its supplies there as well. Russia still, and actually increased supplies of liquefied natural gas carried by ship to Europe last year, earning the Russian state a lot of money. Also just on Sunday, the G7, came together and said, we're going to try to cut Russia out of uranium markets as well. That's another area where the Russians didn't certainly very much push back. So I think the biggest moves have come on the Western side, and it will be about further refining them to effectively try to increase that discount. Russia still has not only more pressure it can use on the agricultural front, I think the gas weapon it can't use anymore, but in particular, there is still very much a risk, and I think that the West should be planning for it, of a sort of repeat of the Arab oil embargo type scenario, where Russia effectively says, we're going going to, cut oil exports to everybody to try to drive oil prices way up and increase those inflationary and economic pressures on the West again as well. And this is where I think Putin has had one very big success over the last decade, slightly less, but the rise to power in Saudi Arabia of Mohammed bin Salman. In the US, there was sort of this narrative that, Salman is, very close with Trump and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and that, MBS is, working on trying to get around his reputation as a pariah for the Khashoggi affair. I think, to be honest, MBS doesn't care, and he thinks that the benefits of the U.S. relationship are in the past and will only continue to fade, and that's been a big factor in his making this OPEC Plus relationship with Russia. So I think Russia could only really effectively use that weapon if it has a tighter partnership with Saudi Arabia. There are still tensions there. It seems so long ago now, but it was just 3 years ago, maybe even today, that oil prices went negative in April, in the middle of April 2020, which was the result of a spat between the Russian state and the Saudi state over global oil supplies in that COVID environment, and trying to use it to increase their market share. But that's where I see the big weapon that the Russians could still use to escalate.